Throughout your life, you've heard about wars, revolutions, and crises in the Middle East. No matter the decade you were born, this piece of land has always appeared in the news with images of destruction, protests, and territorial disputes. But why does this happen? Why is a region so rich in history and natural resources mired in instability? Since the beginning of the 21st century, the Middle East has been the stage for major wars involving countries like Iraq, Syria, Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and Yemen. These conflicts attracted regional powers like Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, as well as global powers like the United States, Russia, and France. The impact? Millions of lives lost, billions of people displaced, and trillions of dollars consumed in conflict. Yet this story doesn't begin with modern terrorism or the region's dictatorial regimes. It starts over a century ago, when European powers redrew the map of the Middle East after World War I. This redesign completely disregarded the cultural, religious, and ethnic diversity of the region, planting the seeds for conflicts that echo to this day. Get ready to dive into a journey through history and geopolitics. We'll explore the origins of this instability, understand the forces that shape the region, and discover how decisions made over a century ago still impact the world we live in. To understand modern conflicts in the Middle East, we need to go back to the period when this region was governed by the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, which lasted from 1299 to 1923, was one of the largest and most influential in history, replacing the Byzantine Empire in controlling the Middle East, Southeast Europe, and North Africa. With Constantinople, now Istanbul, as its capital, it stood out as a center of trade, art, and science. After centuries of decline, it collapsed following World War I, giving way to the Republic of Turkey in 1923. For centuries, the Ottomans controlled nearly the entire Middle East, imposing an administration that maintained relative stability by suppressing nationalist and separatist movements. It was a vast empire, spanning from Southeast Europe to Yemen, comprised of a complex diversity of ethnicities, languages, and religions. However, Ottoman power began to decline in the 19th century, and European powers like the United Kingdom and France saw an opportunity. The Middle East was geopolitically strategic, connecting Europe to Asia, especially for the British, who had commercial and colonial interests in India. They began establishing protectorates in key territories such as present-day Yemen, Bahrain, and Egypt, securing access to the newly built Suez Canal. The final blow to the empire came during World War I, when the Ottomans allied with Germany. Their defeat led to the partitioning of their lands. In 1916, even before the war ended, the British and French signed the controversial Sykes-Picot Agreement. This secret treaty divided the Middle East into zones of European influence, drawing borders that completely ignored the cultural, ethnic, and religious realities of the region. The British took control of areas that included present-day Iraq and Jordan, while the French took over what is now Lebanon and Syria. Palestine, due to its religious significance, was placed under international administration. But these lines drawn on paper without consulting local populations sowed the seeds of rivalries and resentments that persist to this day. The fall of the Ottoman Empire transformed the Middle East into a geopolitical chessboard where European powers played for their own interests. What was once a mosaic of interconnected communities became a battleground for territorial and power disputes. However, territorial division was not the only source of instability. Oil, which was just beginning to be discovered in the region, quickly became a decisive factor in the conflicts. With the new borders drawn after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, something unexpected began to emerge in the Middle East: oil. In 1908, the first oil fields were discovered in Iran, and shortly after, the United Kingdom became one of the main beneficiaries, exploiting these resources through the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which would later become British Petroleum, BP. During World War I, oil proved essential for powering the engines of modern warfare, from ships to airplanes. This placed the Middle East in a strategic position that no power could ignore. After the conflict, victorious nations like the United Kingdom and France sought to expand their influence over territories where they believed more oil reserves could be found. This race for oil control shaped the decisions of countries like the United Kingdom, which established protectorates in resource-rich regions like Kuwait and Iraq. However, the most profound impact came years later when oil began to be discovered in significant quantities across the region. In Iraq, the most productive fields were in areas inhabited by Shiites in the south and Kurds in the north. In Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, the largest reserves were located in regions inhabited by Shiite minorities. In Iran, almost all the oil was found in the Khuzestan province, home to a majority Arab Shiite population. This unequal distribution of resources within the newly created borders by European powers not only fueled internal tensions but also attracted the interest of external forces. For the British and later the Americans, securing control over Middle Eastern oil was more than an economic matter, it was a question of national security. Oil not only brought wealth to the region but also turned oil-producing countries into targets of both internal and external disputes. Authoritarian governments, ethnic conflicts, and foreign interventions were all fueled by this relentless struggle for control. As European powers redrew the map of the Middle East, modern states began to emerge, but in artificial forms that disregarded the cultural, religious, and ethnic differences of the local populations. Iraq, for instance, was formed by merging three former Ottoman provinces: Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra. Each was inhabited by groups with vastly different identities. In the north were the Kurds, an ethnic group primarily Sunni. In the center were Sunni Arabs, who ended up dominating the government. And in the south were the majority Shiite population, often marginalized. Syria was also designed in a way that united different groups with little in common. Alawites, Sunnis, Christians, and Kurds were forced to coexist in one territory, while Lebanon was separated based on a slight Christian majority, though it also included significant Muslim and Druze populations. This fragmentation, imposed from the outside, created fragile states where internal conflicts became inevitable. The Kurdish question is one of the clearest examples of how these decisions left open wounds in the region. Promised their own state during the Middle East's reconfiguration, the Kurds were instead divided among four countries: Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran. Today, they are one of the largest stateless nations in the world, with around 40 million people, often persecuted and discriminated against. These arbitrary divisions also created lasting border disputes. Kuwait, for example, was separated from the Basra province by the British to protect their oil interests. This led to tensions with Iraq, which viewed the territory as a historic part of its nation, a tension that culminated in Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1990. These borders, drawn without consideration for local complexities, turned the Middle East into a perpetually unstable region. But territorial and border disputes were not the only problem. The creation of the State of Israel decades later added another layer of conflict to the equation. After World War II and the Holocaust, the issue of establishing a national homeland for the Jewish people gained international traction. This idea had already been supported by the Balfour Declaration of 1917, in which the British government expressed its backing for the creation of a Jewish national home in Palestine, then under British administration. The UN's 1947 partition plan proposed dividing Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem under international administration. The proposal was accepted by Jewish leaders but rejected by many Arab leaders, who viewed the division as unfavorable to the Palestinian Arabs, who constituted the majority of the territory's population at the time. The Declaration of Israel's independence in 1948 led to an immediate conflict with neighboring countries such as Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, which supported the Palestinian Arabs. This war was the first of a series of Arab-Israeli conflicts that would mark the following decades. Among the most significant episodes was the Six-Day War in 1967, when Israel captured strategic territories such as the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza Strip, Golan Heights, and Sinai Peninsula. These areas became focal points of disputes, negotiations, and uprisings, such as the Intifadas, movements of Palestinian resistance. Moreover, the Palestinian refugee crisis had a significant regional impact. Countries like Jordan and Lebanon absorbed large populations of refugees, leading to demographic shifts and contributing to internal political tensions. The Arab-Israeli conflict also became a catalyst for broader changes in regional politics. While Israel consolidated alliances with Western powers such as the United States, various Arab countries united in pursuit of common strategies, whether through wars or negotiations. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union saw the Middle East as an indirect battleground for expanding their influence. The region's proximity to vital trade routes and vast oil reserves made its control a geopolitical priority for both superpowers. The United States sought to secure its influence by supporting monarchies and allied governments, such as Saudi Arabia and Israel, which became one of its most strategic partners. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union supported nationalist movements and socialist regimes, such as Gamal Abdel Nasser's Egypt, Hafez al-Assad's Syria, and Ba'athist Iraq at various stages. This struggle for influence had profound consequences in the region. In many cases, the United States and the Soviet Union supplied arms, military training, and financial aid to their allies, fueling local conflicts. The North Yemen Civil War in the 1960s, for example, became an indirect confrontation between the two superpowers, with the Soviets backing Republican nationalists and the United States, along with Saudi Arabia, supporting monarchists. One of the tensest moments of this period was the Yom Kippur War in 1973, when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise offensive against Israel to reclaim territories lost in 1967. The United States backed Israel, while the Soviet Union armed the Arab nations. The escalation of this conflict led to a global mobilization, with both superpowers threatening direct interventions. Additionally, the Middle East became a stage for strategic shifts in oil production. The 1973 oil embargo, led by Arab oil-producing nations in response to U.S. support for Israel, demonstrated how control over oil could be wielded as a political weapon. This event further solidified the superpowers' interest in ensuring stability or control over the region. As the Cold War unfolded, it became evident that the superpowers' presence in the Middle East did not bring lasting solutions to regional conflicts. Instead, it often intensified them. By the late 1980s, with the Soviet Union's decline, new forces began shaping the geopolitical landscape. Among them, the 1979 Iranian Revolution stood out as a turning point, profoundly altering the balance of power and introducing a new religious and ideological dynamic to the region. This movement marked the establishment of the first modern theocratic government in the Middle East, rooted in a Shia interpretation of Islam. Under Ayatollah Khomeini's leadership, Iran adopted a policy intertwining religion and governance, proposing a political and ideological model that challenged not only Western powers like the United States and Israel, but also Sunni monarchies and regimes in the region. The new Islamic Republic sought to export its revolution beyond its borders, inspiring Shia communities in countries such as Iraq, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and Lebanon. This stance put Iran on a collision course with Sunni leadership, particularly Saudi Arabia, which played a central role in representing the Sunni Islamic world. This antagonism led to what many call the Middle East Cold War, an indirect conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Both countries began backing opposing sides in regional conflicts. Iran supported Shia groups and allies, such as Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen, while Saudi Arabia bolstered Sunni regimes and groups opposing Iranian influence. The first major confrontation in this rivalry was the Iran-Iraq War, which began in 1980 when Saddam Hussein invaded Iran. The conflict was partly motivated by fears that the Iranian Revolution might inspire uprisings among the Shia population in southern Iraq, where the country's main oil reserves were concentrated. The war, which lasted 8 years, resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths and a stalemate that left both sides weakened but did not ease tensions. Another lasting impact of the revolution was the strengthening of Islamist groups across the Middle East. The Iranian example demonstrated that religion could be a powerful tool for political mobilization, influencing the rise of other movements, both Shia and Sunni. This new religious and ideological dynamic added yet another layer of complexity to Middle Eastern geopolitics, with divisions between Shia and Sunni often overlapping with national and tribal rivalries. As Iran solidified its position as the leader of Shia Islam, the Middle East witnessed the decline of Arab nationalism and the rise of religious movements as a dominant force. Within this context, Saddam Hussein's ambitions turned Iraq into a center of conflict in the late 20th century. After coming to power, Saddam sought to consolidate his influence in the region, unify Arabs under his rule, and challenge the borders drawn in the Middle East. In 1980, he invaded Iran, partly to curb the influence of the Iranian Revolution among the Shia population in southern Iraq. The war lasted 8 years, costing hundreds of thousands of lives and leaving both countries weakened. A few years later, in 1990, Saddam acted again, this time by invading Kuwait. He aimed to expand Iraq's oil resources and solidify its position as a regional power. However, the invasion prompted a swift international response. Led by the United States, a coalition of countries defeated Iraqi forces during the Gulf War in 1991, leaving Saddam's regime isolated and weakened. These interventions, however, left the Middle East even more volatile. The weakening of Iraq and continued foreign involvement paved the way for the emergence of new actors, including insurgent groups seeking to redraw borders and challenge the established order. Decades of instability in the Middle East created fertile ground for the rise of groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. These insurgent movements rejected the colonial borders drawn by agreements such as Sykes-Picot and positioned themselves as alternatives to the perceived failures of nation-states. Al-Qaeda rose to prominence in the 1990s, while ISIS emerged in the following decade, exploiting the power vacuum in Iraq and Syria after wars and international interventions. Both groups used extremist ideologies and violent methods to expand their influence, challenging both local governments and global powers. These movements had a devastating impact, not only in the regions where they operated but also on the global perception of the Middle East, exacerbating conflicts and humanitarian crises. Throughout this video, we have explored how the Middle East became an epicenter of global and regional conflicts, shaped by historical decisions and power struggles. But the question remains, will the Middle East always be at war? Although the roots of the conflicts are deep, history also shows that geopolitics is constantly evolving. In recent decades, there have been significant advancements, such as peace agreements between Israel and some Arab countries, as well as economic collaborations with the potential to unite the region around shared interests. Challenges remain considerable, but the Middle East is also a land of resilience and adaptation. It is up to the world to closely follow the next chapters of this story, which continues to shape global politics.